I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as a leaked call reveals that Steve Witkoff, the US's special envoy to Russia, coached a Kremlin negotiator on how to make Donald Trump more favourable to Moscow's position, we examine the fallout, or lack of it. We also assess new signals that Trump's much-trailed Thursday deadline may not be as cast iron as claimed, before we turn to the reaction from Moscow and across Europe's parliaments to the latest developments. Is it alarm or business as usual?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 26th of November, 3 years and 277 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and our Russia expert, James Kilner. First, though, the latest political developments of the last 24 hours. As we were on air yesterday, news broke Ukraine had reportedly accepted the outline of a new 19-point US-Ukraine drafted peace framework. Details were only just emerging, and the negotiations themselves unfolding in real time, online in public view. We understand Ukrainian officials were receiving updates from the Trump administration on social media at exactly the same time as we were. Within an hour, the White House had doubled down, with President Trump's press secretary saying that there were only a few delicate but not insurmountable details that must first be sorted out. We still don't know what those are, but if, as is speculated, they are about territory and security guarantees, to say they are a question of mere details would seem, well, rather optimistic. According to sources speaking to the Financial Times, in that new framework, Kyiv has agreed to cap the size of its army at 800,000, roughly the size of its current wartime army, but in peacetime. The original plan, of course, brokered by the US and Russia, proposed Ukraine capping the size of its army at 600,000. As we discussed yesterday, this puts Moscow in a difficult position, the same as Ukraine has found itself in several times over the past few months, where if it outright rejects this new framework, then it risks being seen as the main barrier to peace, risking the wrath of the Trump administration. So it comes as no surprise. The Kremlin has said this morning that it's seen the latest copy of the US plan to end the Ukraine war and views some of it positively, with other points requiring discussion. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, added that it was premature to speak about striking a peace deal in the near future. But more on the Russian reaction with James later on. The story that's really sent shockwaves around the diplomatic realm this morning are two telephone calls leaked to Bloomberg. The first is between Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Yuri Ushakov, one of Putin's negotiators, which took place on October the 14th, after the deal struck in Gaza. Key extracts are as follows, and don't worry, I'm not going to do fake accents today. Ushakov, congratulations, my friend. Obviously a reference there to the Gaza peace plan. Witkoff, thank you. Ushakov, you made a great job, just a great job. Witkoff, thank you, Yuri, and thanks for your support. I know your country supported it, and I thank you. Ushakov, yes, you know that's why we suspended the organization of the first Russian-Arab summit. Witkoff, yes. Now, listen, I'm going to tell you something. I think if we can get the Russia-Ukraine thing solved, everybody will be jumping for joy. Ushakov, yeah, you need to only solve one problem. My friend, I just want your advice. Do you think that it will be useful if our bosses will talk on the phone? He's referencing there Trump and Putin. Witkoff, yes, I do. Ushakov, you do? And when do you think that would be possible? Witkoff, I think as soon as you suggest. My guy is ready to do it. Now, what's really significant about this exchange is the timing. You'll recall this was just before Trump was about to meet Zelensky in the Oval Office. So naturally, Moscow would have been incredibly keen for Putin to speak to Trump beforehand to try and derail it, something it seems Witkoff was more than happy to oblige, effectively sabotaging the Kyiv delegation. But then this exchange. Witkoff: Yuri, here's what I would do. My recommendation. I would make the call and just reiterate that you congratulate the president on this achievement, that you supported it, that you respect that he is a man of peace, and you're just really glad to have seen it happen. I think from that, it's going to be a really good call. I told the president that you, the Russian Federation, has always wanted a peace deal. That's my belief. I told the president I believe that. And I believe the question is, the issue is that we have two nations that are having a hard time coming to a compromise, and when we do, we're going to have a peace deal. I'm even thinking that maybe we set out like a 20-point peace proposal, just like we did in Gaza. We put a 20-point Trump plan together that was just 20 points for peace, and I think maybe we could do the same thing with you. So here you have a US envoy advising Kremlin officials on what Putin should say to win Trump's favour, while at the same time, in the eyes of many, showing a fundamental misunderstanding of Putin's goals about the war. Remember, Witkoff, in an interview with Tucker Carlson several months ago, said Putin was straight up with him and that he didn't regard Putin as a bad guy. But Witkoff doesn't stop there on the call. He says, maybe he says to President Trump, so maybe Putin says this, you know, Steve and Yuri discussed a very similar 20-point plan to peace, and that could be something that we think might move the needle a little bit. We're open to those sorts of things, to explore what it's going to take to get a peace deal done. Now, me to you, I know what it's going to take to get a peace deal done. Donetsk and maybe a land swap somewhere. But I'm saying instead of talking like that, let's talk more hopefully, because I think we're going to get a deal here. And I think, Yuri, the president will give me a lot of space and discretion to get that deal. Ushakov: okay, that sounds good. Sounds good. Now then we come to a second transcript leaked to Bloomberg. This one of a phone call between Ushakov and Kirill Dmitriev, the economic advisor to Putin, the one involved in brokering the 28-point plan with the US. This is shorter, but includes this key exchange, referencing the terms of the peace plan they want to pass on to the Americans. Ushakov: well, we need the maximum, don't you think? What do you think? Otherwise, what's the point of passing anything on? Dmitriev: no, look, I think we'll just make this paper from our position, and I'll informally pass it along, making it clear that it's all informal, and let them do like their own. But I don't think they'll take exactly our version, but at least it'll be as close as is possible. So that seemingly confirms the reports that the peace plan was originally drafted in Russian and that Moscow sought to make their plan the plan. Now, these leaks, suffice to say, are huge. Two key questions arise: who leaked them and who does the leak favour? For some, it exposes the entire peace push as a coordinated influence and information operation by the Russians from the start, thereby harming the Americans and indirectly bolstering the Ukrainian position. Indeed, within minutes, there were calls for Witkoff to be sacked. As Republican Congressman Don Bacon wrote, for those who oppose the Russian invasion and want to see Ukraine prevail as a sovereign and democratic country, it is clear that Witkoff fully favours the Russians. He cannot be trusted to lead these negotiations. Would a Russian paid agent do less than he? He should be fired. But for others, this leak could be seen as favouring the Kremlin, revealing the strength of their hand, or potentially derailing these talks, which may be going in a direction they're not comfortable with, especially given the 19-point plan. It's interesting to see Dmitriev claim now that this leak is fake, adding, peace keeps moving forward despite the desperate attempts of warmongers and the war lobby to sabotage it. Their fear media campaigns are loud, but the will of the people who choose peace is stronger. Now, the Trump administration was already on the defensive yesterday before this leak, with JD Vance and Marco Rubio both trying to throw cold water on the allegations. They were at loggerheads over the negotiations. Vance wrote, "The media is lying in order to derail the president's agenda. It's really that simple." And Rubio called recent stories just the latest example of a long-running series of 100% fake news reports claiming a rift inside the Trump administration over how to end the war. These people don't just get things wrong, they literally make things up. When the leaked tapes came to light, Trump seemed, unsurprisingly, nonplussed. Not just defending Witkoff, but then saying he was sending him to meet with Putin in Moscow next week. When asked by a journalist whether he was asking Ukraine to give up too much land, Trump replied Moscow is making concessions, suggesting that over the next couple of months, that territory might have been gotten by Russia anyway. Crucially, when asked about Thursday's Thanksgiving deadline for a peace deal, Trump seemed to shrug that off too. "For me, the deadline is when it's over," he said. But let's go to the European reaction now, and that key coalition of the willing meeting. Dom, you're going to cover this. We're hearing today that Viktor Orban of Hungary may be about to meet too with Putin in Moscow on Friday, perhaps acting as a go-between between Trump and Putin, with Chancellor Merz of Germany giving a fiery speech in the Bundestag saying Europe is not a pawn in global security affairs, joining Finland's Alexander Stubb as saying that this is a critical week for peace. Now, that's something that Stubb has not said before, so worth noting. But what do we know of what was said in that coalition of the willing meeting?
Well, hi, Francis. Hello, everyone. So, the coalition of the willing meeting. It was a virtual meeting yesterday, chaired by Emmanuel Macron, Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer. They're the two co-chairs of the coalition of the willing, which we think at the moment still has about 35 participants, people who said they were up for it, but only, I think, 26, the last number I saw, who were actually said they're prepared to put troops or other stuff into the pot. So, all a bit of a mishmash. We weren't expecting a great deal yesterday from the coalition of the willing. There was enough going on. They were correct to, at least in public, keep their powder dry and not make some radical suggestion which could have upset the apple cart that already had two wheels loose and a few planks missing. But yes, so the coalition of the willing meeting happened yesterday. Before it got going in earnest, Emmanuel Macron said, "The absolute condition for a good peace is a set of very robust security guarantees and not paper guarantees. Ukraine has had its share of promises that were shattered by successive Russian aggressions, and real rock-solid guarantees are a necessity." Fair enough. Any of us could have written that at any time over the last few years. However, after the meeting, Mr. Macron, he was speaking to reporters. He said that France and other European allies would, in the coming days, work towards using frozen Russian assets to provide financial assistance to Ukraine, and reiterated the suggestion that soldiers from France, the UK or Turkey could be sent to Ukraine as part of the reassurance force on the day a peace deal is signed. He said a peacekeeper deployment in Ukraine would not be carried out by NATO, but as part of an intergovernmental coalition. Brilliant. Okay, all fine. Nothing especially new there. And as I say, we probably shouldn't have expected any great movement given all the political flux, and also perhaps more robust action was taking place behind closed doors. Anyway, at the meeting, we are told that Britain's PM, as Keir Starmer, apparently demanded that Britain be allowed to send troops to Ukraine under any peace deal. He was said to have urged the other leaders to step up planning to join the deployment. He said this was all it was a vital part of the security guarantees for Kyiv. He said, "Our military planners have worked really hard in recent months and will continue to work on the readiness of that force. And I urge colleagues on the call this afternoon to firm up national commitments, because we need to ensure we've got the most robust capability and the most robust plans on the table." Just in case you missed that at the back, he's calling for a lot of robust stuff to happen. Now, interestingly, Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, he dialed into the meeting. First time he's done so. President Zelensky also dialed in. I mean, he's a member anyway. He said that the US and Ukraine were ready to move forward with a 19-point plan drafted in Geneva last weekend. He didn't commit to making a trip to the US. However, Rustem Umerov, the National Security Advisor, said that they would find the earliest suitable date in November to complete final steps. So not an awful lot came from it. I would point you to comments by John Foreman, friend of the pod, and former defence attaché both in Moscow and Kyiv. He said overall no progress yesterday. He said it just sort of reiterated this idea, didn't really go any further than suggesting this coalition of the willing would be some kind of tripwire with Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian army in Ukraine. And he made the point, that's fine. Tripwires are there for a reason. It's quite an efficient use of personnel and equipment and resources and all the rest of it. But a tripwire has to be attached to something. Otherwise, it's pointless. And what is it attached to? We don't know.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Just before we go into the military updates, I just got to ask you, what's your reaction to the Witkoff revelations and the latest developments regarding the negotiations?
Well, yes, looking forward to some quiet evening tonight, if such thing's possible. I mean, look, in response to you, Francis, opining on Monday, you mentioned that the US was an unreliable partner. We had a message from Douglas from Vancouver Island. Lovely place. I won't bother with telling you a story about that place, but anyway, I'm very much...
Story for another time.
Naked on a yacht playing Herbie Hancock's Rocket at maximum volume. Anyway, Douglas, thanks for getting in touch. But Douglas invited us to think again about the US being an unreliable partner. He said that was a pathetic take.
Ouch.
Ouch, indeed. Well, I'm not sure if Witkoff's actions are openly colluding with Russia or just stunningly naive, and that he has simply just shown himself to be not competent to be charged with the responsibility he's been given. But I do think the news overnight of the leaked phone call, the Witkoff phone call at least, at the very least backs up the assertion that the US is an unreliable partner. Happy to be corrected on that, Douglas. I think it's a fair comment. As a reminder, of course, Ukraine was the only side to agree to the ceasefire that Donald Trump demanded, a few weeks ago. Russia ignored that demand. That was not backed up by any action from the White House. So, Douglas, how reliable was that? So what's my reaction? Well, Donald Trump says that this is all just diplomatic stuff, just the normal hurly-burly of negotiations. Happens all the time in these kind of situations. So fine, let's hear what advice the administration has been giving to President Zelensky about how to sell any deal to Donald Trump. Donald Trump now says that there's no deadline of Thursday. The deadline is dead. Yuri Ushakov now says that the new draft put forward by the US and championed by Europe requires a truly serious analysis. That's diplomatic speak for kicking the can down the road. No rush at all. So as I hoped when this ridiculous 28-point plan first came out last week, everyone's now playing for time, kicking the can down the road, get through to Thanksgiving, public holiday in the US, make no big decisions now. It all means I think this storm will pass, and that all that's going to be remembered from this week is Witkoff's behaviour. It's also going to be remembered that Trump backed out yet again of enforcing another deadline. And we've also seen how unserious Russia is about meaningful peace negotiations. All, meanwhile, as the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says, Ukraine is now receiving about $1 billion worth of military aid through the PEARL, the Prioritised Ukraine Requirements List, every month. So things are stumbling on. It's not ideal what's happening on the ground. Coalition of the Willing isn't really doing an awful lot, but PEARL is working. The Russian economy is faltering. So I don't think if it were to stop now, everything were to stop and just go quiet now, I don't think Ukraine would push back from the table thinking they've got a bad deal.
Interesting. Well, thanks, Dom. And there's just something I would note. A US ambassador to Russia, former US and Russia ambassador Michael McFowle, who was with Obama in 2012 to 2014, has said, when I worked for Obama, I advised him on how to talk to Russian leaders. I never gave the Kremlin advice on how to talk to Obama. And I talked to Ushakov many times, just to underscore, I think, what you were saying there about how exceptional it is what Steve Witkoff has done here. Well,
we've got a really interesting article on the website now by David Blair, our colleague, the senior foreign commentator, who he's recently come back to us, but he spent about 8 years in Downing Street as an advisor. And he was in the room for many negotiations, and he says he was present in many situations such as this. And he said, yes, of course, it's quite natural to talk behind the scenes, to try and get deals done, to talk and look for ways around and come up with exciting ideas that you might not want to float in public. He said that is all the normal diplomatic stuff. He says what Witkoff's done wrong here is you don't then tell the other side how best to negotiate it. You try and work on a deal, and you work on your side about how to then go into those negotiations. He said Witkoff overstepped the mark there by advising Russia how to handle Donald Trump.
And some are calling this behaviour treasonous. I'm not saying we're saying that, but just to give you a sense of the anger amongst some politicians, both in Europe and indeed in the United States.
We're not saying that, Douglas. We're not saying treasonous.
But before we hear from James for more on this on the Russian side of things, what's the latest on the front lines, Dom?
Yeah, OK, let's go into the Donbass. Pokrovsk seems virtually taken by Russia, although the northern sector is still not closed. It's almost impossible to say that Russia has control of the city, bar the southern approaches, but they do seem to have effective fire control over the whole city, i.e. they're able to bring down very accurate fire anywhere they want. The road east to Minarad seems open, but very heavily covered by Russian fire, including, it's thought, direct fire weapons, as in vehicles, tanks and stuff, so not just drones, mortars, artillery, that kind of thing. Minarad is under extreme pressure right now. There are reports Ukraine has taken Russian prisoners in the centre of Minarad. That indicates continued Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups. It shows that Ukraine is still active there, but it also shows how far Russia has got through Minarad. So if we take a step back, it looks as if both Pokrovsk and Minarad are on the verge of falling, but that has been the case for weeks, and Russia has fought for these areas at great cost for a number of months. Elsewhere in the country yesterday, at least 18 people were injured in Russian strikes overnight on a high-rise apartment block in Zaporizhia region. Comes from local officials there. The strikes badly damaged infrastructure in the city. Footage shows firefighters battling blazes and debris gutted vehicles on the streets. Ivan Fedorov, the regional governor, said a rescue operation is currently underway at 12 locations. The maximum number of units from the state emergency services, national police and our medical teams have been deployed. Across the country, 2 ballistic missiles and 90 drones were fired at Ukraine in the last 24 hours. Both missiles and, it's thought, 10 drones got through. Now, Ukraine's general staff said this morning that their drones hit the Russian city of Cheboksary, that's about 500 kilometers east of Moscow. That strike happened in the early hours of this morning, we're told. Russian Telegram channels suggested the VNIIR progress plant was the target. Blasts heard there just before 3 a.m. local time. That plant is said to design electronic warfare systems, including the Kometa antenna used to jam satellite radio and radar signals. The enterprise is currently subject to sanctions imposed by the US and the European Union. It was last hit on June the 9th, so not the first time it's been visited. Oleg Nikolaev, the head of the Chuvashia Republic, that's the region of Russia where it's located, confirmed the region had been attacked by drones. He said 2 people were wounded in that attack and 2 residential buildings damaged. Just looking a bit wider, Francis, Ukraine has been elected to the Executive Council of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons for the period 2026 to 28. They were elected yesterday along with Slovakia and Slovenia. Ukraine's Ministry for Foreign Affairs said despite Russia's attempts to steal a seat, the aggressor state has failed for the 3rd time in a row. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha said state parties have made a clear choice. A systematic violator of the Chemical Weapons Convention cannot influence the OPCW governing body. Today's victory is not only an honour, but an important instrument to ensure proper and timely responses to chemical threats stemming from Russian aggression against Ukraine. We will continue working to ensure that international law is upheld and that the world remains protected from the threat of chemical weapons. Just for the numbers, there were 146 votes in the ballot, with 74 needed to get a country elected to the Executive Council. Armenia secured 59, Russia 51, so they were not elected. Slovakia with 107, Slovenia 122, and Ukraine on 99 got over the threshold and were elected to that Executive Council of the OPCW. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Let's bring in our Russia analyst, James Kilner. Now then, James, welcome very much back to the podcast. First of all, I just want to ask about the Russian media reaction to the Ukraine peace talks, not just today, but over the past few days. I know that Putin's been in Kyrgyzstan, but over to you, James.
It's great to be back as ever. So yes, in short, for your listeners of the pod, Francis, I think the Russian media and the Kremlin are delighted around all these leaks and problems that the US and the Ukraine and Europe are having getting together this peace plan. And the leaks that you and Dom have just been talking about in some detail, again, play into the Kremlin narrative that Putin, the Kremlin, Russia, they are the peaceful guys here. This is the narrative coming out across the media. We've been seeing this playing out for months, for years. If you remember Putin posing as the peacemaker this time last year, and that's continued. And they're saying, in the spirit of Alaska, we're ready to do a deal. We want to get peace done. It's the Ukrainians and the warmongering EU contingent which is stopping the deal getting done. We have our doubts. We're ready to make peace. Trump is a good guy. Witkoff and co are all good guys. The problem is in Europe and Kiev. That is very much the line that is coming out the Russian media. And the leaks that you guys have just been talking about plays into this. Again, I get the strong sense that the Kremlin's delighted that these leaks have come out. I think it shows Russian statecraft being very effective, and it shows some weakness on the US side. Obviously, Witkoff's style towards interstate negotiations has been drawn into consideration. It's obviously very different from previous styles. And Dmitry have been running rings around him. I think that's fair to say. And it makes the Kremlin good. The way it's been presented in the Russian media is that, and I'm reading a headline on Moskovskoye Komsomolsk, a popular Moscow newspaper, saying that Witkoff has been stabbed in the back. The end is fast approaching. And then there's a long story saying that how Witkoff has been trying to end the biggest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And it's Zelensky and all the Europeans who are literally trying to sabotage all this peace process. So, this all feeds into the Kremlin narrative that they're the good guys and Ukraine are the warmongers, etc. Now, I think these various peace plans and counter-peace plans and whatnot that we've seen, obviously the 28-point plan that was presented at the end of last week was really like a Russian wish list, basically. We've seen plenty of reporting how it was written up by the Russians, presented to the White House, and then the White House would pass it on again, and it's been modified since. The reporting in the Russian media has very much been, this was the plan to end the war. This has now been messed around with by Europe and by Ukraine. And, there's been references to the meeting in Alaska between Trump and Putin, which was a huge propaganda win for Putin. If you remember, he walked down the red carpet and was applauded by Trump. Their first meeting, which was supposed to deliver peace to Ukraine. Again, Putin posing as the peacemaker. And so I think this whole narrative is continued. And now we see, you referenced it yourself, Putin is actually in Kyrgyzstan. He's there for 3 days. It's his first trip since more than 2 years to Bishkek. And he's been hosted by Sergei Japadov. He's there for a meeting of the CSTO. It's a former Soviet security group. It's been in the diary for a long time. So it's not as if he's skipped off to Bishkek and ignored this whole peace process. He's there on a scheduled trip, but it really suits him. It really suits the Kremlin that he's getting on with, day-to-day business of running the country, and the US, the EU, and Ukraine, they're all firefighting. It's all about the Russians being calm, looking like it's business as usual. So interesting sort of propaganda media spin on that whole thing. I just want to bring up one small point before we move on, Francis, if I may. There was a lot of media reporting, I think it was today, about how Daniel Driscoll, he's the US Secretary, and he's the US Secretary for the Army, was in Kiev yesterday talking to Zelensky and his government about various peace plans. And he was profiled quite considerably in the Russian media today. Now, it seems to me that the Russian negotiators are sort of weathered old men who've been around the block a long time. And they're very much presenting Driscoll as this 38-year-old boyish looking chap, sort of mid-ranking government minister. He's been sent to Kiev and sort of a second-tier chap. So again, you've got this sort of careful placing of various issues to make it look like, Ukraine is getting a second-rate option. All the big cheeses are going to Moscow, and the second-rate guys are going to Kiev. So interesting stuff going on here.
Thanks, James. Really interesting to hear your take on all of that. Of course, we heard those remarks, which we reported on the podcast yesterday, I believe, from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, that seemed or could be read as a rebuke to some of the leaks we saw prior to these ones about Witkoff, i.e. the leaks of the plans. And there's been some suggestions that perhaps he's been embarrassed by this. He was already potentially out in the cold, and that this Dmitriev move seems to make his role redundant, and that as a consequence, Moscow perhaps was not as happy with some of the leaks that we've been talking about over the last few days as it perhaps is sometimes suggested in their media. I'm just interested, James, in your take on that.
Well, we've been reading and talking a lot this year about how Lavrov has potentially been sidelined, etc. I mean, I've only seen only a few examples that you can make make a play to make this point. I don't really subscribe to that. Although Lavrov has been around a long time, there are question marks about his health and about whether he actually wants to continue. He may exit, but I don't think it's a case of him being particularly sidelined for Dmitriev or anyone else at the moment. I do think that the Kremlin is making hay while the sun is out. I mean, it's very much the case of while your enemy is making errors, you don't interrupt them, right? You encourage the errors to flow. And I think just talking about the leaks in Russia and in English as well to international media, you're stoking this division. And I think the Kremlin's really using this peace plan to sow division between the EU and the US.
Well, thanks, James, for fitting that in. Let's turn to broader stories then in Russia at the moment. Of course, we always want to focus on the economic picture. And where do you want to start on this, James?
So I come in and I talk about how Russia's facing this economic crisis, etc., the whole time, and how this company is, putting their workers on 4-day weeks, etc. We're now seeing this economic crisis feed into the Russian regions. And this is incredibly important because the Russian regions are at the forefront of the Russian recruitment drive for its military. We had Khakassia in Siberia and Yakutia in Far East Russia, both saying at the end of last week that they're struggling to pay the sort of military bonuses and compensation. Khakassia said they were struggling to pay compensation to the families of dead soldiers, and Yakutia, his finance minister, came on, spoke to media and said they're struggling to pay these massive signing-on bonuses that have committed themselves to. If you remember, Francis, these signing-on bonuses were so important to encourage Russian men into the army, worth like $25,000, which is several years' worth of salary. I mean, I can't stress enough how important I feel this economic malaise is in, or collapse really, is in Russia, and how it, the Kremlin is having to strategize and think about it. And in many ways, to my mind, if the West is going to force Russia to the negotiating table with any weaknesses, it's going to come from the economic side of things. There was a poll out by Kremlin-linked economists this week polling industrial leaders. 66% of these industrial leaders are very negative now about the state of the Russian economy. That's the lowest it's been. That's a drop since October, when the Russian central bank was cutting interest rates and trying to talk up the economy. But the point is here, this is the most pessimistic Russian industry has been since April 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, which really puts into context how much fear the Russian industrialists have over the state of the economy.
Thanks, James. And just finally, we've, of course, been talking a lot about Moscow's foreign fighters and its recruitment of them. And I know you've been looking into a story relating to this.
That's right. This again feeds into the recruitment problems that Russia's having. We just touched on it now with the region struggling to pay signing on bonuses, etc. Very interesting report now by an internet research group called Open Minds, which said that the Kremlin expenditure on online advertising for foreign fighters has increased by 500% over the summer. That's obviously a huge jump, mainly targeted at Russian-speaking men in the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, etc., mainly targeted, but also in Africa, in the Indian subcontinent, and in the Middle East. So interesting there. And Open Minds also said that they've noticed that previously, like in 2024, roughly 7% of the Kremlin's online military advertising was aimed at foreign fighters. Now it's about a third. So again, context for how Russia is struggling to pull in fighters is offering these foreigners Russian citizenship, a large signing on bonus, and crucially is promise also in adverts that I've been reading not to send these guys to frontline shock troops. So interesting side story there, again showing how recruitment in Russia is also slowing down as it is in Ukraine.
Well, thanks very much, James, for your insights as ever. In yesterday's episode, we heard from Telegraph correspondents in Brussels and Berlin to measure the reaction in those key European capitals. Earlier today, Adélie was at Chatham House in London to listen in on a roundtable with members of Parliament from across Europe, including Ukraine, Finland, Italy, Poland, Sweden and Lithuania, to measure their reaction to the historic events of recent days.
The mood at Chatham House today was both sombre and combative. Representatives unflinchingly shared their thoughts on the initial 28-point plan and its redrafts over the last few days.
That this was a Russian trap that, unfortunately, the US got into.
That's Ivana Klimpush-Chinsadze. She's the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on the Integration of Ukraine to the EU in the Ukrainian Parliament.
It's also pretty bizarre that we are discussing something that has been leaked in the media. You don't really know what your negotiating team is discussing in Geneva. You don't really know what has been agreed, what has been left behind the brackets.
None of this changes Ukraine's core message to the world since the beginning of the full-scale invasion.
Russia cannot be talked into peace. Russia can be only pressured into peace. And if Russia is to be pressured into peace, that means a coordinated effort with regard to sanctions, with regard to their frozen assets, with regard to military backing of Ukraine and creating additional capacity for Ukrainians to defend themselves, but also to attack Russian military capacity and, for that matter, the Russian oil refineries.
So why is this plan coming together now? What's the urgency from the Russian side?
The European Union is getting much closer to the decision on the reparation loan. And I think part of the goal of all this exercise right now was to make sure that this reparation goal is not happening in December. Secondly, it was about those sanctions from the Americans and from the UK, from the Europeans with the 19th package of sanctions, which really hurt Russian Federation.
The Lithuanian representative, Žygimantas Paviljonis, he's the head of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance and United for Ukraine, as well as the deputy chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Lithuanian parliament, was equally appalled.
This is a Russian wish list. I don't know how it was installed in the White House at this level. It is insane. I would scrutinize it in Congress if I would be a congressman, because it is against American interest. Because Ukrainian victory and its membership in EU and NATO, if Americans would be wise, they would kneel and pray for it, as we do every day in Lithuania. Russia is a gasoline station run by mafia. If this is mafia, mentality is mafia, they cannot think like us because this is different type of organization. So you either annihilate mafia and defeat mafia. All the wars with Russia started with internal collapse and internal annihilation. Gasoline. Mafia doesn't run without gasoline because it's gasoline mafia. So attack the gasoline. And we are doing actually it successfully. Let's step on that.
For him, if the US wants to turn away from Europe and look exclusively towards the Indo-Pacific, it is not thinking sufficiently ahead of what Russia could do next.
Because we think if we are attacked in the Baltics, it will be at the same time when Taiwan will be attacked. So it's not Russia only, it's China as well. So if Americans are so stupid, like to give a victory to Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, the axis of evil, if they are really waiting for Pearl Harbor, they can, but it's kind of costly. It's much wiser to listen to us because we are the front lines of American dream. NATO enlargement is also strategy. You know, Brits, they were pushing EU and NATO enlargement to the Baltic because it was a strategy. Wonderful decision how to make us rich and shine freedom. Today we shine freedom not only for Ukrainians, for Belarusians, for Taiwanese, because it's all connected. So let's have a strategy how to create this freedom infrastructure, and let's explain to those, how to make it mild, stupid Americans, that this is not Monroe Doctrine of 19th century. If they want to be leaders of the world, they have to invest. And you guys have to invest, because your defense spending is laughable. It's shocking.
Heikki Autto, the chair of the Defence Committee to the Finnish Parliament, agreed that the stakes were existential, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole.
But Ukraine is not the goal. The goal is here in London, it's in Washington, because they want to undermine the most important pillars of that NATO credibility.
The response of countries such as the US, the UK, and France to the Russian threat and to the invasion of Ukraine poses further questions for NATO.
What we've learned as a new NATO member is that NATO is about capabilities that then we can share, and it's about the credibility that we really keep our commitments. And if those security guarantees are not there, if these powers that are the main pillars of the whole world's security structure are willing to compromise on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, what kind of credibility do they actually have after that? And after that, world becomes kind of a jungle, we go back to the time prior the First World War, when it was totally okay to continue foreign politics with some violence and war if negotiations didn't bring you the result you wanted. And that followed with 2 world wars, and we don't want to enter that kind of world never again. So that's why we cannot compromise on, for example, Ukraine's sovereignty, but not with the territorial integrity either. We really ought to do our utmost to pressure Russia out from Ukraine, because that's the only way to have sustainable peace on our continent.
Italian MP Gian Giacomo Calvini argued there was another front where Russia was also active, one equally close to Europe.
Russia is not just in the Russia. Italy is a bridge between Europe and Africa. In the opposite of Sicily, you can find Libya, and you know how it's important and how it's important the presence of Russia in Libya. And you have to think how they are able to be destabilizing this country and the consequence for Italy and for Europe too. If we split, the West would be dangerous, not only for Italy, not only for Europe, not only for Ukraine, but for everyone for the future.
But as in many countries in Western Europe, Calvini admitted that the existential threat is less palpable back home in the south of Italy.
It's not easy to explain to the people in my constituency when I go back for the weekend to my family, to my son, how it's important to try to stop this attack from Moscow and from other countries.
Simon Smith, a former British ambassador to Ukraine, agreed with that sentiment.
That we need actually to beat Russia and to beat Putinism. And why is that important for us? There are still millions of people in populations in Western Europe in particular who think that the view that once Russia has swallowed Ukraine, it will swallow other countries, they think that is just an opinion. The government's messaging has been successful up to a point in saying, yes, we stand with Ukraine, we support Ukraine, yes, we are prepared to express that support in tangible and in significant sums of money, etc., etc. But the conversation with electorate has not been had that says this is why we actually have to commit ourselves fully to this and break away from what has so far been a sort of incremental approach. The conversation that has not been had is the one that says it requires of us a considerably greater effort to apply that critical stress to Russia.
If everyone agreed that Europe needed to rise to the occasion, one word, however, did not make it through the conversation, and I think that's pretty telling. It's the coalition of the willing. To Ivana Klimpush-Chinsadze, the answer lies with Ukraine's accession to the EU as well as to NATO, and for Europe to finally take charge of its own future.
The momentum for internal change in the EU to actually take the decisions that would create a much more efficient decision-making, and somehow this momentum is fading. And so somehow we are back to square one in terms of, not back to square one, but we are back to kind of normality of this process, which is not acceptable for Ukraine. I don't see it coming at this point. That there is consensus-based willingness to have a ad hoc decision for Ukraine or some special arrangement for Ukraine. This type of discussion is not happening at this point. If we are serious about protecting your own security, and I'll be very cynical, not only using Ukrainian people dying on the front line to hold on till you are getting prepared and ready to deter or push back on the Russian attack. If we are really serious about common future, then it's time to act.
Let's turn to our final thoughts now. Then, Dom, where do you want to leave listeners today?
I'd like to say hello to Kevin. Good to hear you're back safely from your latest visit to eastern and northern Ukraine. But I would like to leave listeners, if I may, Francis, on a slightly lighter note, although it's pretty heavy, if you know what I mean. Anyway, let me explain. Thanks to Travis and Darren for highlighting this separately, 2 separate emails. A Ukrainian has won the latest sumo competition in Japan for the first time. This is 21-year-old Ionashiki Arata. He was born Danilo Yavizishin in Vinnytsia in Ukraine. He's won the November 2025 Kyushu Basho and has clinched his first top division championship. This is only 3 years after leaving Ukraine as a teenager to get away from the war. Now, Darren says that in under 2 years, Nishiki has climbed from newcomer to elite division contender, collecting double-digit winning records, special prizes, and now a full championship. It's an acceleration, Francis, you'll know this, an acceleration rarely seen amongst the foreign rikishi. Anyway, Travis says the next stop is the Ozeki rank, and then who knows, maybe even a Yokozuna promotion. I've no idea what any of that means, but well done to Anashiki, and thank you, Travis and Darren, for pointing us to those stories.
There was recently a sumo contest at the Royal Albert Hall. I wish I got tickets, actually. That would have been fascinating to see.
A number of people from here went down and said it was absolutely brilliant. I don't, what is all the salt, though? You chuck the salt, is that to appease the gods or something at the start? You chuck salt into the sumo ring.
I'm sure listeners will know. It sounds...
Travis, Darren, what's with the salt?
Right, well, answers on the back of a postcard as ever, please, folks. And actually, I should just say as well, before I go to James for his final thoughts, that do send in your questions this week for us to answer in the newsletter. I know lots of you have been submitting them in relation to some of the nuances of these different peace plans. But if you've got broader questions as well about the war, of course, we'll be prioritising answering those on Friday. But James, where would you like to leave listeners today?
Francis, well, I will bring you guys back to the peace process and really make the point that the Kremlin sort of answer to the peace process was set by Putin himself at the end of last week when he appeared in military uniform, talking to his generals underneath a banner which said, "Those who fight win." So clear messaging there. The next day, he held a Security Council meeting and said that Russia's ready for peace negotiating, but is also satisfied with the current dynamics on the battlefield. So I can't stress enough that Russia is really sort of sitting back and waiting for the West to trip itself up and getting in a model around these peace negotiation deals, Francis.
Well, thank you very much, James.
The salt is to purify the ring before the match and get rid of evil spirits. So do you need some salt to purify your ring and get rid of evil spirits, Francis?
I can think of one evil spirit I'd quite like to get rid of. Thanks, everyone. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.